Hello and welcome to the 12th episode of the Pepper Podcast. For those who are returning, welcome back. And if you are new, the Pepper Podcast covers a wide range of spicy events that occur in our daily lives. Two high school students tackle heated topics through discussion. I'm your host, Jay Mehta, and joining me is my co-host, Andy Watanaskanpan. And today's topic will be over immigration and how it has dynamically changed to fit modern society. There was around a total of 46.2 million immigrants, which is around 14% in the country in November 2021. So this is the largest number of immigrants ever recorded in any government survey or census going back to 1850. So that's a pretty large number. So Andy, tell me some of your experiences with immigration.
Thank you, Jay. So obviously coming from uh, a Thai kind of background, my dad is an immigrant from Thailand, and my mom was born here, but she moved back to Thailand when she was young, grew up there. So technically, they're both immigrants from Thailand. So I definitely have some experience with immigrants because my parents are immigrants, and so like I'm first generation here.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and it's kind of it's diverse. I think that's what I could describe it as. It's diverse because you get growing up in Tennessee, especially, you get the world of like the everyday American, like people who have been here for upwards of a few hundred years,
Mm-hmm.
versus people who come here seeking for opportunity and education, stuff like that. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's different because like when those worlds collide, it can be good and bad.
Yeah. And
And
like
I think I've seen both of those.
personally, like my grandparents or my grandfather came to the United States as an immigrant.
Yeah.
And so we both come from a background of immigrants. So I feel like we provide an interesting perspective on this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I guess switching away from our personal experiences, I guess something that really drives immigrants, and this goes for any immigrant really, is their hardworking mindset.
I
And so
agree.
some data around this that supports this, so it's not just coming from me, is that immigrants in the United States as a whole have lower levels of education than the U.S. born population. So in 2018, immigrants were over three times as likely as the U.S. born to not have completed high school, which is around
Yeah.
27% versus 8%. However, immigrants were just as likely as a U.S. born to have a bachelor's degree or more, so 32% and 33% respectively. So it's very similar, even though we like might not have like the same amounts of education, we're still have that hardworking mindset to get towards the goals that we need. And in this case, it's education. But I think it shows
Yeah.
really that um, we've gone far immigrants as a whole have gone far by through their hardworking mindset, which contributes to jobs and all that, which we talk about later.
Yeah. And I think, an important distinction to make between immigrants as a whole is, legal versus illegal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And obviously there's the major differences. One came here and is in the US legally versus the other it's illegally, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And I think that personally, like the distinction isn't made a lot. Like people don't know the nuances of the terms illegal versus legal
Mm-hmm.
because a lot of times you see on the news like people who have been like called for like the police have been called on them because they're like harassing people who don't look your average white American, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, are you legal? I'm gonna call ICE, blah 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 blah. Like
Yeah.
those kinds of like microaggressions and crimes still happen every single day,
Mm-hmm.
and like that kind of profiling and aggression towards immigrants. And I think that it's just like a lack of education and understanding, like
Mm-hmm.
ignorance
But
that they have.
I feel like it's been portrayed by the media as kind of almost one-sided in their
Yeah.
aspects, regardless of the media source, of course. But
Yeah.
it's kind of been narrowly sided, where
Yeah.
you're pretty much given the idea in one narrow viewpoint, um, and so it's hard to really make a conception for yourself,
Yeah.
um, or create the idea for yourself on what an immigrant really is.
Yeah.
So yeah, just putting that out there, like exploring the nuances behind them is something that's very important. Um, but yeah.
Yeah. And I think, when we talk about illegal immigrants, a lot of them don't even know they're illegal immigrants, right?
Mm.
They were born here because of their parents came to the US looking for better opportunity. And I think that's also something we can talk about is like people don't emigrate from their country and immigrate to the US or any other country just for the sake of it. They are doing it for better work
Yeah.
opportunities, better quality of life,
Yeah.
better education, or they're escaping some sort of
Hmm.
conflict,
Yeah.
you
And
know?
that's the entire point of immigration,
Yeah,
right? Is
exactly.
to
It's not
have
like
a
they're
better
trying here.
life.
They're like trying to be here because they're trying to like take your jobs or they're trying to like hurt you as
Hmm.
an American citizen. They're
Yeah.
doing this because of their own family and their self. And I think that you would do that too if you were in their position. You know what I mean?
And I feel like that's why governmental back government backed position like programs exist, like the Dreamers and DACA and things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Um, but again, there is nuance to that, where there are people that enter the United States to,
I agree.
um, I guess, like steal jobs and things like that, and that's where it's very deeply rooted in American culture with the nativist sentiment, um, where
Yeah.
it's kind of the idea that immigrants are coming in, and I mean today, right? And so I talk about it's morphed into different, the kind of definition has changed throughout the years.
Yeah. I agree.
But in the earlier times, immigrants were mainly Irish, and Protestant,
German, Dutch. Yeah.
German, yeah,
Yeah.
and they were very hardworking. And the Chinese, of course, they were
Yeah.
hardworking. And they received a lot of criticism, um, and again through many discriminatory practices,
Yeah.
some legal, some through like governmental laws, and some not, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and things like that.
Yeah. I
And I'll
agree.
talk about the Emergency Quota Act a little later, but
Yeah.
that's a little later in time. But there was prejudice against these immigrants, and so it's kind of, I guess, the idea of nativist sentiment has continued throughout the years, um, until now, where I guess who your main target group that's being prejudiced against is the, people of Hispanic origin,
Yeah.
and so it's kind of changed throughout the years, but the idea of the nativist sentiment has always remained, which is something that I find interesting.
And like what you said about like Hispanic people, like Hispanic looking people or people who don't look, white American, quote unquote, again. Like I think a lot of that also can be carried over to Asian Americans, especially East Asian Americans, because
Hmm.
like, the recent COVID pandemic has
Hmm.
kind of spurred a lot of racist sentiment and
Yeah.
like it's your fault or and then like it's just caused a lot of aggression and you see all over the news hate crimes being reported and people getting stabbed, killed, shot, assaulted just because they're Asian.
Yeah.
And I think that's disgusting, but like as you said, it's kind of like a cultural thing. Racism isn't something you can solve quickly. It's something that takes it's ingrained, it's a learned thing.
Yeah, compilation of like hate crime data published by the Center of Study of Hate and Extremism revealed that anti-Asian hate crime increased by 339% last year compared with the year before.
Well,
So, again, COVID has been a big perpetuate of that.
yeah.
Um, but I mean, I guess the idea of discriminatory practices has always again continued,
Yeah.
um, mainly with now, um, your East Asians, your Hispanics. Europeans don't really get that much
Yeah, it's
discrimination,
because
but they
like
still do.
it's yeah,
But it's not in the grandiose scheme compared to, I guess, comparing
yeah.
that to East Asians and
And
Hispanics.
I
It's a lot
think
different.
because of that, right?
Hmm.
Like it's because most European immigrants, if you're talking about Polish immigrants, Swedish immigrants, German immigrants, French,
Hmm.
Britain, Scottish, Irish, whatever, they're very obviously white, right?
Similar, yeah, similar in
Yeah.
race, right?
So
So
it's
it's a
it's
lot.
really hard to like overlook
Mhm.
how like once you like glance at them, you're like, oh, they're American, sure, because they're white, right? However, you know how America was like originally colonized by Native Americans, but we already covered that. But yeah,
Mhm.
and so
That was for a
they
previous
pass as
topic, not for
white.
a future one.
Yeah, it was a previous one. Yeah, and they pass as white,
Yeah.
so they kind of get all the like they kind of get like treated as white. You know what I
Yeah, and
mean?
not
Like
even like they're not really. It's like one glance and that's it. It's not
yeah,
really look at it's not necessarily like you stick out. You kind of just blend
exactly,
in with
exactly.
everybody. You might be like a little bit different, but I mean, you're more acclimated and you're a lot more similar compared to
I agree. Yeah.
those of other races. But
Yeah.
and I'd also like to bring it nuance into this, right? Um, like I said, the United States is one of the most diverse places in the world, so we've gotten a lot better with racism and everything like that. Racism's still prevalent. I feel like that deviates a little bit from what I'm talking about. Immigration has allowed for more collaboration and diversity, which is good. But I want to talk about the Emergency Quota Act, which is what I mentioned previously. So the
Yeah.
Emergency Quota Act was signed into, I believe, 1921, where the United States, through discriminatory practices, set quotas on the amount of immigration allowed by country. And so they let these larger Western European nations like Great Britain, Germany, and things like that to have above 50,000 people immigrate to the US versus these Eastern European nations and these Middle Eastern nations um, ha- are virtually like it depends, of course, but it's
Yeah.
around on average around 10,000. Um,
Yeah.
so there's a major difference
Yeah.
between that.
I believe it was like for like East Asian populations and like non-European immigrants, it was about 2% of the population according to the census.
Yeah.
So like they used the census and used a quota system based on the census to determine how many were allowed in the
Yeah.
US.
And so these are very discriminatory, again, towards people of, in this case, Middle Eastern descent or in Eastern European descent.
Yeah.
Because in Turkey, only 1,000 to 5,000 people were allowed to immigrate to the United States,
Yeah.
compared to Germany, which has above 50,000. So
Mhm.
it's definitely crazy that it's just that large population wise. But again, it has changed since then, which is great.
Yeah.
Um, but again, it just goes to prove that it is very deeply rooted into the American culture.
Country's history, yeah, it's like marred into the history of the US, and it's always been like the US has always been like, the melting pot of the world where like opportunity is rampant. However, a lot of these problems are overlooked. Like while it's important to recognize our successes and the good things about our country, it's also important to never forget our history with these kinds of like legislation and that have been hurtful to people all over the world,
Mhm.
right?
But
Yeah.
and I feel like a root cause of this is I guess underfundedness, for lack of a better word, really. So I have some data, of course. So like since 2003, the budget of the CBP, which includes both the Border Patrol and operations at ports of entry, has also nearly tripled, raising from 5.9 billion in fiscal year 2003 to a high of 17.7 billion in fiscal year 2021. Yet there are still rampant issues going on, and I feel like the extra funding, has grown because of the extra issues.
Yeah.
Yet it's there's still they still come in such high volumes that it's very difficult to like control that many people. um
Yeah.
and so it gets difficult at a point where there's not really a point where you can save money and you're spending too much money when and basically you have to cut costs where you can't really have that extra funds. And so there's been a lot of there's been more cases of immigrants coming in and being detained and going through ICE and things like that, but we're not receiving a whole lot more funding, at least currently.
Yeah, I agree. And so I just wanted to go back,
Hmm.
to what you were talking about, how about what you mentioned, how like immigrants had a lower education level, however, would like on average would have the same like uh
Like
or like
bachelor's
degrees and
degrees, yeah.
stuff. Yeah, they're able to get those degrees at the same rate or like
Hmm.
how have them. So like I think it's an interesting kind of point of view to look at immigration through the lens of education,
Hmm.
right? Because like as we've repetitively said, education is kind of the key to escaping a lot of problems,
Poverty and everything,
And I
yeah.
think immigration it kind of affects education, like the education system affects immigrants differently than it does normal, like
Yeah.
Americans. Yeah, right. So you obviously said that immigrants don't get educated as much. A lot of that has to do with like illegal immigrants because like to be enrolled in a public institution, it's risky to do that or like very, very difficult to do that if you're an illegal immigrant, right?
Mhm.
And while a lot of people may think like, yeah, they're not really contributing to education, immigrants aren't contributing, that's not true because like if we look at the sectors for like education, a lot of them are working in childcare
Mhm.
and like daycare services. So like one out of every five are for one out as of the research.newamericaneconomy.org, more than one out of five of every childcare workers are foreign born. So that means that there are almost 785,000 immigrants working at U.S. colleges and universities, which also make up one in six in education.
Mhm.
You know, so there's over 200,000, if we say, in childcare and daycare services, which makes one out of every five, and 785,000 immigrants working at the U.S. college and institutions, which are one in every six workers in higher education.
Mhm.
That's kind of very impressive in my
And
opinion
and going
because like
off that, or
yeah,
sorry to cut you off. Going
I was
off
just gonna
that,
say like yeah,
like in 2020, a 2020 article showed that undocumented immigrants make up approximately 3.2% of the US population, but 4.4% of the country's workforce, and there are more than 7 million undocumented immigrants working in the United States, which shows that they do comprise some of the workforce. That's
yeah,
all I just want to say.
and with talk about workforce and immigration, you're always gonna be met with like immigrants are stealing our jobs, and then you know what I mean. But that according to the statistic you said, that's not true because it's been found that on average, immigrants actually increase your income. Like on average in the US, they increase the income because immigrants tend to, especially illegal immigrants, tend to work more and harder. So like they work more than what they take as, like compensation for their
Yeah,
efforts.
not to
So they're
mention that they
putting that
work
money
like
into it,
much
like
different.
increasing our economy.
They work in much more difficult jobs as well.
Yeah, they're
Just
much more strenuous and like laborious
yeah,
jobs.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, that really shows that yeah, like you said, that it does contribute to like higher wages and more finances or more capital being circulated in the community and throughout in circulation, which is always good. But um, there's just, I guess there's it's very nuanced of an issue because it's been politicized, which I'm not gonna touch into.
Yeah.
But it's just very polarized at this point where it's difficult to be a middleman in the situation.
Yeah.
Um, but immigration has its positives and it has its negatives, of course, pretty much like
Yeah.
anything. Um, but I guess talking about immigration, in particular, like the immigration and the job scene, immigration, has helped for a lot of diversity and a lot more uh, like more projects to be created that would have not been created before, uh, because of the amount of diverse thoughts and collaboration between people. And of course, the more diversity you have, the more collaboration you have, and the more different your ideas are, which can contribute to like a better workforce. So the amount of capital being gained is actually a lot greater when you have more immigrants come in than it does then you have like less immigrants. And so,
Yeah.
but I guess there comes a point where there are places with super high like housing prices because of it's like pretty much where only immigrants live, and it's very difficult to find housing and things like that. And so it's always a nuanced issue.
Yeah. I agree. And on the topic of immigration and education, we can't really ignore the fact that, you know, immigrant children or children of immigrants, they also get affected in the school system.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have personal experience with this when it comes to like, racism, right? Like I'll just say it like racism
Mm-hmm.
because immigrants usually look different from their peers, especially in Tennessee and especially in the school that I went to, right? I was like the only Asian kid in class, so I was just like I didn't feel any different, but I was treated differently,
Yeah.
by my teachers too. But I was treated differently, and that can have a negative effect on mental health, self-esteem, academic achievement, etc., etc.
Hmm.
Because you're like, I don't feel different, but I'm getting treated differently. So yeah,
Yeah.
and also like the threat that a family member or you could be deported, right? This is going back into illegal immigration, and obviously I don't really have any experience with this because my parents immigrated here legally, so I don't have to, worry about that.
Yeah.
But children of legal immigrants or children who are illegal immigrants, they number one have a language barrier, right? When communicating with teachers and classmates, so it's hard for them to understand certain things. And number two are constantly under the threat that their parents or they or a family member might be deported, and that like kind of environmental change can disrupt education for them majorly.
Yeah. And not to mention, right, going back on what we said about like, contributing to the economy and finances and things like that, immigrants make significant contributions to our economy on virtually every front. So including tax revenue, where they contribute 458 billion to state, local, and federal taxes in 2018. So this includes undocumented immigrants, which contributes around 11.74 billion in state and local taxes, including more than 7 billion in sales and excise taxes, 3.6 billion in property taxes, and 1.1 billion in personal income taxes. So these, fund our schools, hospitals, emergency response services, highways, roads, infrastructure, everything, right? And so these revenues would increase by 2.18 billion annually if these undocumented immigrants were given legal status as part of an immigration reform package. And so there are, again, positives to immigration and all, but like, and additionally, immigrations make enormous contributions to Social Security. And so, if current legal immigration levels were cut by 50%, the Social Security fund would lose 1.5 trillion in revenue over the next 75 years. Um,
Yeah.
just want to emphasize that it's 75 years. So, not to skew any data or anything, but 1.5 trillion over 75 years, um, I guess can contribute to a lot over time. And so, even just including them would save the United States, or generate the United States a lot more money than um, normal, which is, I guess, good for our economy. But
Yeah, and I appreciate you for mentioning that, but also like like in schooling, I've been doing some research while you were, explaining.
yeah.
Um, it's shown that immigrant students tend to be concentrated in poor, like lower socioeconomic areas, and they also speak another language at home besides English, which is a predominant language in this country, right?
Hmm.
And enter school later than non-immigrant students. Like, if we look at poverty statistics, a recent report on immigration and education from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, states that in 2012, the PISA test, which was it's administered to 15-year-olds in 65 countries, including the U.S. The U.S. immigrants scored about 20 points lower in reading and 15 points lower in math.
Mm.
So that's just like basic data that shows that immigrants or immigrant children aren't performing as well academically compared to their like non-immigrant counterparts in the school system. Um, but like just because they're immigrant students at a school, like that's correlated with lower test scores, it's not directly related, right? They tend to underperform because they're a 54% of immigrant families in the US qualify as low income as of 2013.
Mm.
So we've already mentioned and set precedent that income and education go hand in hand. The higher you make, the more well off you are, the better education you get. So it makes sense that if 54% of immigrant families in the US qualify as low income,
Hmm.
then obviously the children of immigrants or immigrant children, right, will be performing less on average or worse on average than their non-immigrant counterparts in schools.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
again,
Also,
that all contributes to
sorry,
the
like
Americans. I'm sorry, I cut you
one more
off.
thing to like
Get go ahead.
kind of reinforce that. Like in 2015, nearly 10% of students in K through 12 in the US were classified as English language learners, which means that like that's just proof that language barriers explain a large portion of the achievement gap in immigrant backgrounds. That means only 10% of students in K through 12 were classified as English language learners. That's a lot, but also we have to take into consideration that's also a little bit at the same time. Because of the 90%, what amount of those 90% aren't English language learners and struggle with English at school, being it not their primary language. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So like all of this goes hand in hand to like decrease say decrease immigrant achievement in school.
hmm Yeah, and just to reinforce what you were saying, the poverty rate was around 14.1% among immigrants compared to the 9.8% for the U.S. born residents. And so some 32.2 million immigrants live in the nation's 95 largest metro areas, accounting for 17% of the total population. And so, with immigration and poverty in America's suburbs, it's really important that we mention, like again, like you said, living below the poverty line and living for or qualifying for reduced lunch and things like that. So that again, like you said, does contribute to these test scores, lower test scores, and all. But I feel like this all ties back to the idea of the American dream, which we can, I guess, talk about more. The American dream is something that uh, was really something that was like a push or like a pull movement that
Yeah.
attracted people into the United States because people thought that the United States was a place where you could do anything. You could get the
You
best.
can be anything you
The yeah,
wanted, do anything you wanted, if you worked
exactly.
hard for it. Yeah.
If you worked, as long as you worked very hard for it, you can get pretty much be whoever you want to be. And that's why immigrants tend to have on average, like a much higher like work ethic compared to U.S. born population, because they came from a poor background or a place where their life was generally worse, of that kind of background, and so the idea of if I work hard, I can have a better life, or my kids can have a better life, and that's something that's really perpetuated. There we go, got it in this one. That's perpetuated throughout, the years for generations to have your kids work, have your make your kids have a better life. So if I work
Yeah.
hard, my kids can have a better life, and that cycle continues. And so this American dream has really it's somewhat falsified, because it's being
Yeah.
over
Yeah.
exaggerated, and that's contributed to a lot of um, controversy, I guess, because at times there are too many people entering the United States, and we have to put some quotas and some regulations on that. But the American dream is really what has pushed so many immigrants to come to the United States. Just wanted to.
Yeah. I agree. And after consideration of like what the American dream was in my English class, like I never had thought about like what exactly the American dream was, but like it's kind of subjective.
Yeah.
It's something that's like always going to be out of reach no matter how hard you go for it, right?
hmm
Like you always want more. You always want to be happy. You always want what's better for your family. But a lot of that just isn't true for immigrant families. Because what it used to be, in the 20th century, or like mid to early 20th century, is like, come to the US, we have a lot of opportunity, we're thriving. If you work hard, you can have, it's like the white picket fence and like the yard and the
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
house,
yeah.
the little family, right? That was like kind of like the trope.
hmm
However, I think it's also like if you work hard enough, you can climb up the social ladder.
Yeah.
You can get better and better. And you're not stuck in like a caste system or stuck in your little class, right? You can work hard for it. But I think a lot of times that's kind of romanticized because it's not reality.
hmm
Because once you come here, the American dream isn't necessarily handed to you.
Exactly.
There's so many barriers, uh, be it racism, like institutional like discrimination, workforce stuff. It's a lot, and it's hard for a lot of people to kind of get out and like get up the ladder,
Yeah.
especially in the 21st century, in the more modern times, right? To be honest, I personally think that the American dream is kind of like on the decline, or the interpretation of the American dream is on the decline, right? While yes, the US has many opportunities, it's a lot of people have been saying it's not worth it to come here and struggle for a lot just to climb up a little bit. But it's still the only choice for a lot of people. And I understand that. Like if you're coming from one of the Northern Triangle countries, right? Like they have like a lot of climate change stuff. They're ravaged by natural disaster, economic collapse. corrupt political corruption, their one of their only choices is to go to the US. And
Mhm.
they'd rather risk their life to help their family. And I really respect that personally. Like, you're willing to do that to work hard for your family and escape that. But I think that it's kind of misconstrued what the American dream is today, you know?
Yeah, and I feel like what's really pushed that is the thinking of, or it's how in the 21st century we've moved into a more digital world, and
Yeah.
where it's a lot easier to, especially now with COVID, you know, pretty much moving everything online, it's a lot easier to work pretty much anywhere in the world. And so where the United States used to be a like pretty much a like a standard, like a number one standard, a set standard for what service should be, right? Because we're a service economy, service based economy. It's really become something where we don't really necessarily have to be in the United States or be in one spot to do our work. We can be anywhere around the world. And this only goes for really tech jobs. It's difficult to be, let's say, a plumber and go around the world, plumbing. But for tech jobs, especially because tech jobs, the internet is very fast around the world, yet there's still tons of people that are not on the internet, even but for the people that are, right? There's so much that
Yeah.
goes on, right? Using Google and Facebook and all these social media things and search engines and all that. The the amount of jobs and the amount of work that can be done online, especially now, is so grandiose that living in the United States or even living anywhere that you want is it's just plausible. Um,
Yeah.
and even like living, that's why a lot of people and a lot of companies are coming to Tennessee because of its cheap cost.
Yeah.
Because very low property taxes, like, and very low sales tax and no income tax and things like that. It's very attractive for people to come in. Um, but even just outside of the United States, people are moving elsewhere and living in Airbnbs and things like that just to live and
Right.
enjoy, but in which they couldn't do before or couldn't do as much before. And so the
Yeah.
idea, I feel like what you said about the American dream being diminished, I I wouldn't necessarily say that. I would say the idea is changing, where the idea of the American dream is less of something on living, like you said, in the picket fence and everything, and it's more
Yeah.
of living your life at this point, where it's living a life where like, now that we have a lot of stress and, all you're doing is being on a screen, it's now just living a life in which you're happy in. And that's what's and again, that's been a main goal for the entire time, right? I want my kids to live a better life.
Yeah.
And I want to live a better life. I don't want to live in these worse conditions. When I can move somewhere else and be in a better place.
Yeah.
And if it comes at the risk of, nativist sentiment and, being called names and discrimination, then, I mean, people are much rather willing to face discrimination than live in their own countries. But that's why
I
a lot of
agree.
people moved, uh,
Yeah.
whether it be out of necessity or desire. But now that it's a lot easier to move and, go from place to place, people are reconsidering, right? So the American dream has shifted to something, and I guess I would agree with its diminishing, but like the American dream is something that has changed into living a comfortable life now.
And yeah. And just to segue from kind of like the reasons of immigration and kind of the change in American dream, we can talk about the US immigration courts because that is a behemoth of an institution to analyze.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to give out some statistics that I've collected. As of 2014, judges take approximately 1,500 cases a year. And like breaking that down, that's like what, like 4 to 5 cases a day. If we're talking 365
Yeah.
days a year, right? And as of 2021, December 2021, the number of pending immigration court cases, so the backlog amount, reached an unprecedented 1,596,193.
Wow.
That is an astronomical amount of cases that need to be uh, kind of gone through. That And that's just increasing because I know as of 2013 it was like 1.4 million. So
That's absurd. And
yeah, and like going back to the 1,500 cases a year, judges in immigration courts can be fired for not working fast enough,
yeah, and
which put
that's 4 cases a day, by the way.
no, exactly. And they're already underpaid, right? They're already underfunded. And so if they can be fired if they're underfunded, they have 1,500 cases a year. So like four or five cases a day, and can be fired for not working fast enough. What's stopping them from just being like deported, and like not really necessarily looking at the case in detail
Hmm.
and being an actual judge?
Yeah.
I'm not saying all judges are kind of like bad. I'm just saying the system is set up so that judges can't do their job effectively and thus kind of disproportionately represents immigrants. And not to mention that immigration courts don't provide public defenders or lawyers.
Yeah.
So most immigrants actually go through the immigration process in the courts without being having like legal representation.
Yeah.
And
And
that
again, the language
is
barrier
also
as well.
worsened by the fact that there are so many language barriers amongst immigrants because they're not from the US, English isn't their primary language, and it's hard to, especially legal terms,
Yeah.
right? It's hard to express those ideas in languages that they are not going to understand. So a lot of times they have translators, and a lot of times these translators, right, are only available over the phone.
Mm.
So it's not just an inconvenience of not being able to speak the language. It's not just an inconvenience of having a judge that may be partisan to like, work faster, kind of glance over your thing. It's also an inconvenience of having your translator, your means of communication to the judge who could determine your life in the future in the country over the phone and not in person.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
definitely. I think that's emotionally very like hurtful almost
Yeah.
because it's very difficult to be in a position where you don't understand what's going on, and the only, I guess, opportunity that you really have and the only way that you can understand anything is a lot more difficult to access. And it's sad that it's been set up that way. And I'd like to add on to your point about judges and things like that. 4 cases a day, 4 to 5 cases a day, and they're completely booked. So like if you have to book an immigration, like, like court, if you have to go to court for anything immigration related, they're booked for several months. And so
Yeah.
it's very difficult to, because you have to sit and wait for your time. And so some people cannot really afford to wait that long, or they have to leave for a certain period of time and then they have to come back and things like that. That's very difficult um, for people to, wait that long usually. Um, and so
Yeah,
it's
I
just
agree.
it's a very not very well thought out system,
Yeah,
where it's pretty much rewarded going as fast as you can instead of
I agree.
really analyzing and seeing what's going on and trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, I agree. It's just like immigration is such a kind of like a politically hot topic in the country that it's hard to get any like meaningful conversation without it becoming polarized and without like an argument or conflict occurring because it's such like a political topic or like made out to be such a political topic. But like a lot of people just aren't educated enough or like not informed enough about the statistics and like how bad it really is, the system of immigration in the US, and like how hard these immigrants are working and like what the loopholes they have to go through just to make it.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
definitely agree.
yeah. And with that, our discussion comes to an end. We thank you for listening and hope you'll stay tuned for future episodes. Don't forget to follow the Pepper Podcast on Instagram, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you.